The Frank G. Zarb School of Business and WRHU-FM Radio Hofstra University invite you inside the Z-Suite.
Hello, I'm Janet Lenihan, Dean of the Frank G. Zarb School of Business at Hofstra University. Welcome to Inside the Z-Suite, featuring current topics and talks with business leaders across every industry. Today, we're turning the focus to biotechnology, or biotech for short. Exactly how does it impact us? To start, biotech has been part of our lives for centuries, with its first practical use in making items such as bread. Its applications have improved medicines, therapies, plant productions, food preservation, packaging, and textiles, and that's just to name a few of the daily necessities that biotechnology has impacted in our lives. It has become a mainstay of society and will continue to provide solutions that drive growth in multiple sectors throughout our nation and the world. Joining us today to talk about the influence of biotech, including why and how the industry is expanding into the Long Island region, is life sciences business leader Andrew Whiteley, Vice President of Business Development and Technology Transfer at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories, a center of excellence in our region where scientists have achieved Nobel Prize-winning breakthroughs in medicine and genetics. Here, Andrew leads a dedicated team that supports scientists in commercialization activities, such as licensing, startup companies, corporate partnerships, and academic industry collaborations. Before Cold Spring Harbor, he served as Director of Scientific and Medical Program at the Lustgarten Foundation and was CEO of 3 newly launched biotech companies. Andrew, welcome inside the Z-Suite.
Hi, Janet. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. So, a lot of people have heard the term biotechnology and biotech, but I don't necessarily know they really understand what it encompasses. So perhaps we can just start at the very beginning. Can you give us a definition of biotechnology? What is it? Where did it come from?
The history of biotechnology goes back a long time. It turns out that it was first coined by a Hungarian pig farmer. Perhaps you didn't know that.
I did not know that, I can say.
And so in a
fact.
scientific discipline basis, it's actually the application of science and engineering principles to the processing of materials by biological agents to provide goods and services. So it's all-encompassing today. We'll talk a little bit today about the emergence of certain industries like the pharmaceutical industry, and they are very well connected to this whole area of discipline. This actual area of technology, as you mentioned, started, you were saying bread, and I would probably say beer and wine, in the whole area of fermentation. It was only in the 1800s that Louis Pasteur, a very famous French scientist, observed that it was yeast that was causing the fermentation of sugars into alcohol. And this started the chase to actually industrialize this process.
It's actually so fascinating. So there's so many different aspects of our society that's really touched by biotechnology. Can you share a little bit about kind of those broad applications and the different branches?
In those early days, this idea that you could industrialize the production of yeasts to have a beneficial effect and actually to eliminate a lot of the variability that you had in bread or in beers and wines by actually culturing and propagating those yeasts in a more controlled fashion. Before that, before really understood those mechanisms, it was naturally occurring yeasts that actually triggered the initiation of fermentation. But once you could industrialize the process, then a lot more consistency was brought to the products. And that is still the same today. And so fermentation techniques are still utilized by the drug companies, not so much on yeast so much, but certainly on bacteria and other organisms that can actually be used to make these very complex molecules that have a use in a drug situation.
So I've had the pleasure of touring Cold Spring Harbor Labs, and it's just fascinating what is happening within the different laboratories. And so what excites you most about what's on the horizon and the significant breakthroughs that you see in the biotechnology space?
I always back our scientists at Cold Spring Harbor Labs. We're actually embarking upon our own growth of the institution of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, a $400 million initiative that we are starting to develop some new areas of research, but also reinforce some areas that are existing specialities and expertises for our institution. We call it the Foundations of the Future, and we're going to be building new laboratories that are going to look at neuroscience in decoding the mysteries of certain diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, because these are tremendously difficult areas and high unmet need for management of patients in the latter stages of their lives usually. But we're also investing into an initiative called the Brain-Body Program. And the Brain-Body Program is looking at diseases like cancer in a much more holistic way, thinking about how treatments are impacting on the different areas of the human organism in thinking through the way that you can design therapies in the future. And then the third area, we're calling it neuro-AI. So artificial intelligence is everywhere today, as you'll be aware of. But more specifically, there's a discipline that if you look it up called neuromorphic computing, this whole idea that we can really reduce the amount of energy utilized by computers by designing them to operate in the way the human brain operates. Because it's estimated, and it's a big span, a computer takes between 10 and 100 times more energy to process a given technical operation than the human brain does. So you think of all of the energy that's consumed in data centers across the world. Even recent news from some of the big players have been reporting huge increases in their budgets because of the cost of using energy to generate AI-based applications. So there's a huge unmet need to actually think about ways that we can adopt capability to neuromorphic computing.
It's so fascinating, right, to think about how AI is going to impact the whole biotechnology space. Certainly that's tremendous, right? But are there other examples of how AI will impact what you do at the labs and what bench scientists do and how they carry out their work?
Yes, AI impinges on certain areas. But I must say that Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory is famed for its in-depth generation of new knowledge. Now, one thing that AI won't do is generate new knowledge. It uses repositories of existing knowledge to try and make things more faster and more efficient. However, there are parts of the generation of information in the biology domain, for instance, in the area of predicting protein structures in the biological system, that are starting to be implemented on a computer-based platform. And there are commercial capability out there that can actually help do this. And obviously, if we can understand what's happening at the biological level, then the whole idea is that we can then design interventions or drugs or therapies to actually overcome problems in the human system.
Just incredible. And you can see why there is a lot of interest in investing in biotechnology. And certainly the payoff could be massive if that particular innovation actually gets to market. Certainly there is a tremendous amount of risk associated with that. And many of that actually stems from even being able to bring, let's say, for example, a drug to market and get it through the approval process. And I know it is incredibly complex, and so this is probably a little bit of an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Can you give us just kind of the 20,000-foot view? Take us through what a drug would have to go through in terms of patents, in terms of FDA approval process to get to market, and what are some of the places you see that new drugs might get tripped up in that process?
Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory works on the fundamental biology, which is at the earliest stages of discovery and understanding. With discovery and understanding, you can then design molecules and biological components or even cellular systems that can actually intervene in the biology. And so this validation goes on at institutions like Cold Spring Harbor Labs as the precursor to the formal process of ensuring that these interventions or drugs are actually going to be safe to use, effective, and actually improve the lot of the patients that they're being targeted towards. And that effort is overseen in the drugs industry by the FDA. And the FDA has a very well-defined process of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials where patients are recruited to be the initial recipients of new drugs under very controlled circumstances that will eventually lead to new approvals. However, it would be great to think that every time we test out a new idea, then that would be a new therapy, and off we go. We've launched a new drug. Unfortunately, the confounding reality is that the human body reacts in many different ways to the first ingestion of a drug. And literally, if you counted the success rate, it's much less than 1 in 10 drugs that go into the clinic actually emerge as an approved pharmaceutical drug. And this attrition is most often due to unexpected effects or toxicities that are seen in patients only when you actually test in patients. So whilst it's common knowledge that we utilize laboratory animals for doing testing of drugs to try and predict their effect, the reality is, whilst we've cured mice many times over, thousands of times over, the realities of the human system are much more complex.
Really is fascinating. Here in the States, is that process in terms of the FDA approval process, is it different globally? Do other countries have different processes, quicker processes, or is it that, it needs to go through those different levels because it's so critically important to make sure we get this right?
Yeah, the basic structure of clinical trials is the same the world over. Every government, pretty much, apart from certain examples like the EU, require drug approvals to be made on a country-by-country basis. Interestingly, this is the same set of rules for patenting. So the rights in any national jurisdiction are defined by the government of that jurisdiction. And so, we have to be aware that when we're patenting a product, there are certain processes that allow us to file generalized patents that will be applicable across the world. They still have to be applied for country by country in their own local language in a lot of cases, even though the content might be very much the same country to country.
I think that's another area that people know the word patent, but might not really understand kind of what that process looks like. I know you had shared with me some examples of patents gone wrong, if you will, major innovations and discoveries not actually being protected for the original researcher.
The rules around patenting evolve and change dynamically, so it's driven not by practice, but by case law. And so what you can patent and how you patent it, what the barriers are, the hurdles you have to jump to get to granted claims on a patent are dictated by the marketplace itself. And so patents basically is a deal with the government that says if you can define something that's new and innovative, has not been described before, then you get the right to sell that exclusively for a period of time. The patent term in the US is 20 years. However, the drug development process that we've been talking about usually consumes about 10 of those years. And so the reality is that the pharmaceutical companies that rely on the fact that they spend money and spend for 10 years, that they can recover that money in the 10 years of active patent life. And of course, there's well-characterized examples where at the end of the patent life, generic options come in and there are significant price drops in the marketplace for certain classes of drugs. So the pharmaceutical companies understand this, but it's a risk-driven industry and it requires capability, not just scientists, but also clinical trial specialists, of the physicians that manage the clinical trials, of the people that run companies, the people that operate the companies. And one of the collaborative outcomes that we are working together with Hofstra on is to try and find ways that we can educate scientists in the processes that we're talking about here so they can be more effective in an industrial setting.
And how important is the startup culture in biotechnology? Is it all big pharma, or is there an opportunity for startups?
Startups absolutely drive innovation in the biotech and pharmaceutical world. And this is because the risks are so high. So pharmaceutical companies are enormous entities. In order to commercialize drugs on a vast scale, you need huge resources. And so the big pharma typically have 40 or 70,000 people. However, their innovations come usually from the much smaller groups of people that operate in biotechs. Biotechs are not funded fully by pharma companies. They're funded by entrepreneurial venture capitalists who are willing to put risk capital to work to actually invest in new ideas and new inventions. And eventually, most of these companies are actually bought up or acquired by the big pharma who have the scale and the global reach to be able to be successful in selling those products across the globe.
So you mentioned a little bit about the partnership between Hofstra and Cold Spring Harbor. Can you talk more about that partnership, but in relation to biotechnology in our region? In other words, what does our region need to do to really ensure that we have the infrastructure to support keeping our innovations here within our region?
We're super excited about this partnership because one of the elements is that our scientists with amazing global level talent on innovation very often come to the end of perhaps a postdoctoral fellowship and then choose to go into industry, and without any of the training that would be expected of them if they were to be taking on their first industrial position. And so our students are very excited about the idea that they can build on their life science and scientific skills and knowledge with knowledge and skills around how you run a company. How does a company get capitalized? What are the processes and legal structures that are needed to be successful? And so our collaboration, where we can provide this type of training for students, is going to be fundamental in the way that those really talented postdocs that come through our institution are going to be able to follow an academic path and become professors, or they can follow an industrial path and become great industrial scientists.
So our governor has actually indicated that the Long Island region should be a driving force for science and for innovation. And certainly Cold Spring Harbor is a leader of that, as well as Hofstra. What else do you think is going to be important for us to ensure that, we've been talking about the 495 corridor for decades. Do you think biotechnology is an avenue that can help us start to really create those high-paying jobs to allow people to stay here on the island? And how can we see that come to fruition?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I hesitate to stray into topics of political intent. However, the reality is that, here on Long Island, we see some of the most talented people depart for other locations. And that brain drain is very damaging to the economic success of the region. I think the great thing about promoting companies that are based on lab work, on actually requiring their scientists to perform experiments, it's not the sort of work that you can do as a remote worker. So I call these sticky jobs. These are jobs that have to be done, and they have to be done inside of a laboratory. And that laboratory is not going to be based in somebody's garage. It's going to be in a professionally managed infrastructure that also needs to be built and developed. And so we're super happy that the governor and the Empire State Development effort has been investing into infrastructure that's going to allow institutions to build and develop on Long Island. Recently, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory has benefited from a commitment into a new pancreatic cancer center that is going to be focused around new therapies for this really terrible form of cancer that has such poor prognosis for the majority of patients. But there's also investments into infrastructure to bring a brand new area of science, which is called cell therapy, to Long Island. So cell therapy is taking the ideas of fermentation, and instead of just thinking of it as a means by which a microorganism can be propagated to produce an active agent, you actually use a whole cell to treat somebody. There's a few hot areas of science that are included here, one of which is called CAR T cells, these chimeric antigen cells that are actually cells that are taken from a patient, modified using molecular biology techniques, and then sent and put back into patients to actually make them more active in bringing down cancers and other cells that need to be eradicated in the human system. So it's like using the human's body that has naturally protective elements and engineering it in a way that you can actually get therapeutic benefit from that. And so CAR T cells is one of the areas of cell therapeutics that's going to be important in the future.
just, incredible in terms of not only the impact right on our region and on our communities, but really globally, how this technology and these new innovations can actually change the world. And it's interesting, in a recent report by Deloitte, the author stated, and I'm going to quote a minute, biotechnology innovations can hold the pen in rewriting our prevailing narrative on health equity to change the story from one of disparity to one of prosperity. And I'm just curious, what do you take of that? Is it true that these technologies and these new innovations that are occurring here in Cold Spring Harbor Labs and at Hofstra and of the other great science organizations throughout our region, will it have a global impact?
Absolutely. So, in fact, the pharmaceutical industry is one of the few places where the benefits of the drugs are seen worldwide. It's so expensive to develop new therapies. You have to be successful on a global basis in order to get the return on the investment that you're seeking to make. But there are some other words in that description that are pretty important. So, disparities is a huge issue on a global sense. There are structural issues about ensuring that diversity occurs in clinical trials, for instance, which is not within our purview, but something that we strongly encourage, because one drug is not going to react equally in every person, every different phenotype and genotype of the people. So diversity is really important there. But there is also this role for biotechnology in the propagation of food and energy. So one of the critical issues we've got as a planet is figuring out ways in which we can feed the masses, and power the globe in its ever, inexhaustible demand for energy production. And so biotechnology has a role to play. And we do a little bit of that at Cold Spring Harbor. And we're thinking about ways in which we can utilize our plant biology and our genetics, where, we've got a long history of success and Nobel Prize winners in this field, actually figuring out ways in which you can modify plants so that they're more productive in the environment in which they're growing, for instance. So having a one-size-fits-all for propagation of corn, for instance, or soy is not going to be enough. The parameters, the biological environment in which it's grown differs if you're in the north or if you're in the south of the country, from the perspective of water utilization, the fixation of carbon and nitrogen as fundamental parts of the growth of plants, and reaction to the things that eat plants, so bugs and weeds that actually reduce the yields. So a lot of what biotechnology does today is to figure out ways that you can evolve plant breeding in order to get better yields in the agricultural environment.
Well, Andrew, you've given us so much to be hopeful about. I mean, it really is such an exciting area, and it's going to have continue to have tremendous impact on our society. But we are towards the end of our interview already, and I do have a couple of quick questions that we like to ask all of our guests, similar to Bernard Pivot and how he would frame these types of questions. So I just want you to answer right off the top of your head. Are you ready?
I guess.
All right. If you could trade places with anyone or anything, who or what would it be and why? My
nephew works on this enormous sailing ship as a bosun. And I'm a mad keen sailor, so I live vicariously through my nephew and his amazing life as a young man in his early 20s on a below-decks type setup. So that's what I do.
That's wonderful. All right. What is your favorite household chore?
Am I allowed to say cutting the grass?
Sure, if that's what you enjoy doing.
I've never paid anybody to cut the grass. I've always cut my own grass. I do remember one of the times my parents have both passed, but they came to the US and we had this enormous yard. And my dad says, you need a lawn tractor here. And he always aspired to having a lawn tractor. And I have a lawn tractor, and that's what I cut the grass with. I find that very therapeutic.
That's wonderful. What's your least favorite chore?
It's long projects. At home, I don't mind doing anything as long as I can get it done in a day. I'm terrible at working through stuff that lasts weeks and weeks and weeks. I'm never going to embark upon fixing a kitchen. That's way beyond the scope of my ability to concentrate around one task. So maybe I can break it down into small pieces, but I'm basically, let's get this done fast, let's get it done effectively.
That's great. All right, final question. Who or what has been the key to your success?
Oh, wow. I mean, I think we all think about our mentors through our careers. I can think of people that encouraged me to move from a laboratory environment where I wore a lab coat, but I quickly outgrew the lab coat and went into business. So that was an important transition for me. But really, I've been in science all my life, and my great inspiration were my parents. And I know that's a soft answer, but my dad was a vet. He was always a proponent of science, of innovation. He'd conducted drug trials of novel anesthetics on animals as a local vet, and my mum was a cookery teacher. And so they inspired me to understand the process of science, and I think about them every day on that basis.
And that is not a soft answer at all. It's a beautiful answer, and certainly parents play pivotal roles in all of our success. So, Andrew, thank you so much for sharing your insights today and educating us about biotechnology. We're grateful for you to have been here. And so once again, industry expert and scientist, Cold Spring Harbor Vice President Andrew Whiteley has joined us today to discuss biotechnology's history, influence, and expansion, including opportunities in our region and advances now and in the future. Thanks also to our show's producer, Adrian Stoller, and WRHU audio engineer, John Mullen, for your support. Be sure to tune in each week on the radio and online to WRHU 88.7 FM, Hofstra University, for a new episode of Inside the Z-Suite, or catch up with our show wherever you enjoy your podcasts. For more information about this program and the Zarb School of Business, please visit hofstra.edu/business. Until next time, I'm Janet Lenihan, Inside the Z-Suite.